In this video, I will discuss every fugal passage from the Beethoven symphonies. I don't think I missed any, but if you think I did, you can tell me in the comments section. The first example occurs at the beginning of the slow second movement of Symphony No. 1 with this subject. Notice how similar this is to the opening fugato from the second movement of the Opus 18 No. 4 string quartet that he composed around the same time. Both subjects have the same overall melodic contour, they share the same triple meter, they both feature many staccato notes, and they both have this initial distinctive upward leaping fourth. If you haven't already watched it, please click on the link to my prior video discussing the spectacular triple fugato that begins the recapitulation section of this quartet movement. Rather than merely restating the initial fugato from the exposition section, Beethoven instead combines the subject with two new subjects in three-part invertible counterpoint. In the similar movement I'm now discussing from the First Symphony, Beethoven follows the same formula, and the recapitulation section begins with a double fugato that combines the original subject with this new subject. This is not the last time Beethoven would use this exact formula in his fugal sonata movements. For example, in the fugal finale of his Opus 59 No. 3 quartet, he also begins the recapitulation section with a double fugato, combining the original subject with this new subject. The even-numbered Beethoven symphonies, 2, 4, 6, and 8, have many wonderful contrapuntal passages, but none that qualify as fugal. Luckily, the odd-numbered symphonies have more than enough examples to compensate for this. I've already discussed in painstaking detail Beethoven's most mind-blowingly complex fugal symphonic movement, the finale of Symphony No. 3, the Eroica Symphony, so please also watch that video if you haven't already. The Third Symphony also has two additional fugal passages that I'll now discuss in this video. First, near the beginning of its iconoclastic opening movement, we hear the triumphant Eroica theme, leading to this dotted motif that cycles through various instruments, followed shortly thereafter by this more intense galloping figure. Later, in the development section, the cellos and basses play the dotted blue figure to introduce a brief double fugato, with the violas playing the dotted figure as one subject, and the cellos playing a second subject that at least partially resembles the galloping figure. This small fugato is used as an intensifying prelude to my favorite part of the movement that I'm withholding from you now because I'm saving it for one of my next videos that you should stay tuned for: most badass passages of each Beethoven symphony. The other remaining fugal passage from the Third Symphony occurs during the second movement that opens with this funeral march theme, answered by this contrasting theme in the relative major. The fugal passage is a double fugue that occurs later in the movement, following a restatement of the funeral march theme. Just for a quick tangential comment, I always chuckle when composers from this era redundantly announce major-minor mode shifts in the score. The fugue begins with this blue subject, motivically related to the contrasting major theme from earlier in the movement, combined with this new red subject. Notice that the first four notes of the blue subject are just the inversion of the same pattern from the previous theme. In other words, now ascending rather than descending. The fugue continues by incorporating this additional yellow countersubject, gradually intensifying and culminating in the most impassioned, anguished moment of the entire movement, when the lower strings play these rhythmically faster fragments of the blue subject, juxtaposed with these triplets played by the first violins. Part of what makes this moment so intense is the half-step dissonance created by this Neapolitan A-flat major chord played over the dominant pedal tone in the bass. The passage now comes to an abrupt and disquieting halt with this diminished seventh chord before finally resolving to another restatement of the funeral march theme. The fugal passage from the Fifth Symphony is the trio section from the Scherzo in Trio third movement. The Scherzo section begins with this pianissimo introductory theme, leading to this relentless fortissimo theme played by the horns, consisting of the so-called fate motif, a rhythmic pattern that pervades multiple movements of the symphony, including, of course, the famous opening bars of the first movement. I will almost certainly discuss this topic in more detail in my upcoming video. Notice the interesting similarity between the introductory theme and the opening theme from the finale of Mozart's great G minor symphony, No. 40. I'll play them one after the other for comparison. Near the end of the scherzo section, the two themes are combined, leading to an unexpected, lively dance-like passage played by the first violins over the original introductory theme, crescendoing to one last statement of the fortissimo theme. The fugato of the trio section now begins with this subject that I'm highlighting blue because of its motivic connection to the dance-like passage that foreshadows it in the scherzo. Now listen to the end of the scherzo and the beginning of the trio. The cellos and basses now play fragmented, stuttering false entries of the subject, before launching again into the fugato, that ends the second time with a final statement of the subject by the solo flute before returning to the scherzo. The Seventh Symphony has one brief fugal passage near the end of its second movement. The movement begins with an A minor chord played by the winds, followed by the main theme, a quasi-melodic rhythmic ostinato that includes these light blue ascending portions. This ingenious opening continues with gradual additions of contrapuntal layers, and as I've mentioned in other videos, this is one of my favorite moments in Beethoven's music that I'll likely discuss in a future video. Near the end of this movement, the fugal passage begins with a subject based on the ascending light blue portions of the original ostinato theme, paired with this additional red 16th note subject, and eventually also combined with this yellow syncopated counter subject. Fugues by their very nature tend to intensify as they go, and this one is no exception, crescendoing to a final fortissimo statement of both subjects before returning to the contrasting B section in the parallel major. The Ninth Symphony, like the Third, contains multiple fugal passages, the first of which comes during the development section of its opening movement. I'll be discussing the famous opening bars of this movement in my upcoming video, but for now I'll just play the eventual emphatic entry of the main theme that consists of these two important motifs, on which the remainder of the movement is based. In the development section, these entries of the blue motif introduce the beginning of the fugato. One of the subjects is the blue motif, now expanded by repeating the last portion with a syncopated tied note joining each repetition. It appears combined with this second 16th note subject that, if you look closely, is actually partially derived from the first subject. In addition, we have this yellow passage that I hesitate to call a third subject since it mostly consists of one syncopated note in different registers that often lines up with the same syncopated note in the blue subject. I've decided to count it because the syncopation gives it a distinct rhythm and the leaping gives it a distinct melodic contour. These subjects cycle through the instruments, eventually also combining with this intense, relentless hammering rhythm from the timpani and trumpets. The material from this fugal portion of the development section makes a surprising reappearance in the coda section, where the horn suddenly starts playing a very sunny, dolce version of the blue fugal subject in D major, joined by the oboe, bassoon, and flute. Now comes an equally surprising shift back to D minor, as the blue subject played by the strings is combined with the red subject played by the woodwinds. This might make some listeners wonder whether another complicated fugal section is about to ensue, when in reality the return of this material is fleeting. The scherzo second movement of the Ninth Symphony also begins with a brief fugal passage. I discussed the entire trio section in my last video, and the scherzo section deserves at least that much commentary, but that will likely come in a future video. For now, I'll just play you the opening outburst consisting of this dotted falling octave motif, and then the opening 5-voice fugato with a subject that begins with the same motif. I also have to mention what I think is one of Beethoven's most ingenious orchestration choices: the decision to accentuate just the first note of every measure by doubling it in the woodwind section. Lastly, the choral finale of the Ninth Symphony contains 2 extended fugal passages, both based on the famous Ode to Joy theme, so called because the text of the movement is based on the poem An die Freude by Friedrich Schiller. You likely already know what this sounds like, but to refresh your memory, I'll play my favorite iteration of the theme from the beginning of the movement, played by the first violins with lush accompaniment from the other strings. As I mentioned in my last video, this was a runner-up for the most beautiful passage from this symphony. Later in the movement comes the so-called Turkish March variation. In the 18th century, and in this case the early 19th, European and particularly Viennese composers were fascinated with the exotic sounds of music played by Ottoman military bands. As you can see, even just a few years after Beethoven's death, the Ottoman Empire still extended significantly into the Balkan Peninsula, relatively close to Vienna. To simulate the sound of these military bands, Beethoven scored this variation with a bass drum, cymbals, a triangle, and a piccolo. Notice that Mozart also used this combination of instruments in his opera The Abduction from the Seraglio, since one of its main characters is an Ottoman pasha or military officer. Regardless of whether it's politically correct, composers in this time period also used Turkish music simply to represent warfare or militarism in general. I briefly discussed this in my prior video about Haydn's Military Symphony that also uses similar instrumentation. Beethoven likely chose to make this variation a Turkish march because the text during this section is talking about a conquering hero. The march begins rather humorously with just the bass drum, bassoons, and contrabassoon playing offbeats, eventually leading to this rhythmically marchified version of the main theme, played by the horns, clarinets, piccolo, and oboes. Now listen to the beginning of this variation until the entrance of the solo tenor singing the text. This march variation ends by immediately launching into a double fugue with this running eighth note subject combined with this subject that is based on the rhythmically marchified version of the main theme. In addition to the combination of both subjects, listen for these strettos of the final portion of the blue subject, and for this passage based solely on the red subject. The fugue works itself into this final frenzy, after which the horns are left alone to play the rhythm from the march. The woodwinds now play these false entries of the main theme, leading to this triumphant variation with the original version of the theme now accompanied by running eighth notes that resemble the red subject from the preceding fugue. Immediately after the first fugal section and the following triumphant variation, the tempo changes abruptly with this andante maestoso section, during which the text, "Be embraced, you millions, this kiss is for the whole world," is sung to this newly introduced theme, first unaccompanied in the lower voices and instruments, and then in the higher voices and instruments, accompanied by gorgeous harmonies that include this amazing suspension. This theme will become one of the subjects in the subsequent double fugue. This slow section ends and introduces the double fugue with this eerie diminished seventh chord that, with the eventual addition of the A and the bass, becomes a dominant minor ninth chord. The fugue now begins with the recently introduced theme combined with a triple meter version of the main Ode to Joy theme, also appearing as a decorated version in the first violins. Notice at the end of the fugue that the sopranos and multiple instruments have this piercing high A sustained across multiple measures. This is a good example of a pedal point occurring in the top voice as the underlying chords change, as opposed to the much more commonly occurring pedal point in the bass. Please refer to my prior Bruckner video for a detailed discussion of pedal point. Now listen to the entire final fugue from the Beethoven symphonies.